Next, welcome Atlantic staff writer James Fallows.
For years, my wife Deborah and I have traveled across the country, especially to smaller towns, to learn about those parts of the American story. For a conversation about the future of travel, including to rural areas and small towns, I'm glad to welcome the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky. Thanks so much for joining us. I have some questions about your business in the olden times and in the future times. I wanted to start with one big picture question. Of all the enterprises that have been affected by the pandemic, yours has to be one of the most affected. You're about mobility, and people have not been mobile. What's the main lesson or surprise or discovery that you personally have taken from the experience of the last 8 months or so?
We lost about 80% of our business in 8 weeks, a business we'd spent about a decade building. That was quite surprising. But the thing that may have been even more surprising is what happened next. And what happened next is that people, no matter the circumstances, in the midst of a pandemic, still had a desire to travel. They didn't want to get on planes. They weren't necessarily traveling for business. They didn't want to go to crowded tourist districts, but they did want to get in a car and drive a tank of gas and go to another community and live in that community. And often some of them, were getting homes in Airbnb. And so I think there's just this fundamental desire that people have to travel, to connect, to see the world. And I don't think that anything can stop it, let alone a pandemic. Obviously, people have to do it responsibly, but there is still a very strong will to see the world. It just has to be done in a much narrower context right now because of the health and safety ramifications.
Something that's fascinating about Airbnb is it's a new way of doing something that people have done for a very long time, of travel, lodging, seeing different parts of the world. And because it's been done for such a long time, there's a large structure of regulations and tax arrangements and the other ways in which the lodging industry has historically been regulated. The fact that you're doing that in a new way has led to some tensions with especially city governments. I understand that the Airbnb has a new way of approaching this, your relationship with city governments in particular. Can you tell us about that?
I mean, one of our guiding principles is that we want to strengthen the communities that we serve. Now, I will say that I started this company with my two friends when I was 26 years old. I had one job before this. And, when I came to Silicon Valley, the culture of Silicon Valley was technology may have been a dictionary definition synonym for the word good. And if you were in the technology industry, you felt like you were making the world a better place. Well, one of the things that happened is our companies got so big that I think something that's occurred to the industry and all of us is that we have a greater responsibility for the activity happening on our platform. That the kind of culture of the Web 1.0, that the internet's an immune system, and if you give the community tools to regulate themselves, is probably not enough, and that you actually have to take more responsibility for the activity happening in your platform. And so that's one of the things that we started doing a number of years ago. And to date, we have more than 400 partnerships with cities. And just to give you an example, we've collected more than $2.5 billion in hotel tax. But the problem is that we're in 100,000 cities, and every city is a relationship. And it can be very difficult to have these relationships on a total one-off basis. And the other thing that's happening is in the pandemic, people aren't just traveling to 20 or 30 cities anymore because they're getting in cars and they're going to smaller communities nearby. And so what we want to do is we want to now be able to scale these relationships and allow thousands of cities to know the activity happening on Airbnb, get the information they need, be able to contact us, and be able to have basic compliance tools. And so what we're creating is this product that we call the City Portal. The City Portal is basically a one-stop shop for a city, a small town, or even a rural community to be able to partner with Airbnb. So again, you would get three things. They would get data and information about the nature of the Airbnb activity in their city. They would be able to contact us and know who to contact for which problems. And the third thing is that we are building some compliance tools so that they can essentially help administer the activity happening in their city.
And is that what stage is that out now? Is that being rolled out?
So we are now launching that, and we're launching that now in I think around 15 cities. So we partnered with about 15 cities to work, and we obviously want to design it with these cities. We don't want to just drop something on hundreds of cities. But our vision is that we're eventually going to roll this out to thousands of cities and communities. Anyone that wants to partner with us.
There's one other long-standing challenge of the United States through the centuries of its history, and especially America of this year, of reckoning with racial justice and racial injustice. Because you're dealing with millions of people, some of the people you're exposed to are being discriminatory, whether they're guests or hosts. How is Airbnb dealing with this part of the American challenge now?
Yeah, certainly. Well, the whole idea of Airbnb was kind of a people-to-people platform. The idea is give people the power and they can do great things. And so that is mostly true. The unfortunate thing is so long as discrimination exists in the world, it also exists on our platform. And a number of years ago, in 2016, this was brought to our attention that there was some systemic racism happening on our platform. And so we worked really closely with civil rights groups. We've done a lot of work. We make every single person who joins Airbnb sign the Airbnb Community Compact, Community Commitment, which essentially means that you will pledge not to discriminate against others. Believe it or not, 1.3 million people have chosen not to sign that commitment, and they've left our platform for good reason, or thankfully they left our platform given they aren't committed to the values we're committed to. But more recently, we took a bigger step. We worked with Rashad Robinson and Color of Change, which is the largest online civil rights group in the United States. And we created a project called Project Lighthouse. And the idea of Project Lighthouse was to be able to measure how much discrimination is actually happening on Airbnb. And so we worked with Color of Change and leading privacy rights groups to create a first-of-its-kind partnership in technology. The idea is this. We're going to basically collect, anonymized perceived race information. And we had to work with civil rights groups and privacy groups to do this in a very responsible way. And we are using this to try to measure how much systemic discrimination people are experiencing in Airbnb. And then once we actually can measure it, we can improve and design our product to actually reduce the amount of bias happening on our platform. I think this is going to be a long, long challenge. This is not something that I'm expecting us to change overnight. So long as there's discrimination in the world, it will probably exist on Airbnb. But our challenge is to make sure that the gates inside of Airbnb are more inclusive and you have a greater sense of belonging than the gates outside of Airbnb. And hopefully we can lead the way forward. And then if we learn something and we make some improvements, maybe we can open source some of those learnings to other companies. So that's essentially the idea.
So one follow-up about that. You mentioned earlier that the sort of change in consciousness of your peers in the tech industry of recognizing there are downsides to new ways of doing things in addition to pluses. Do you have the sense that most of your peers share your awareness that they have to think about the racial effects of their tools and the politically divisive effects?
Well, I mean, the tech industry is thousands and thousands of companies, so it will be hard for me to generalize too much, but I will say that I think there's been a broad reckoning and awakening in the tech industry. And I do think that I can't speak for everyone. I can't say where they all are, but I think the general mindset of the culture is totally different than it was more than a decade ago when I came here. I think it is a very serious topic that comes up in numerous conversations. And I do see leaders taking it very seriously. And but that doesn't mean we're doing enough. And so I often ask myself, years from now, when we look back on ourselves today, will we say we did enough or will we feel like we should have done more sooner? And very rarely will you be able to look yourself in the mirror, be honest and say that you're not going to say, wow, I was too bold or I was doing just enough. And so that is a constant reminder that we could be doing more. And I think history is watching.
Thank you for that. Back to the travel question now. You mentioned earlier that people want to travel, but they're doing it in different ways. They're driving as opposed to flying. They're traveling domestically as opposed to internationally. When Deb and I were traveling, we often heard in places like Fresno or Allentown, PA, or Duluth, Minnesota, or Greenville, South Carolina, or Bend, Oregon, that people would sooner or later recognize the virtues of operating from smaller, less expensive places as opposed to the Bay Area or New York City or LA. Are you seeing some analog to that in travel to rural areas, to smaller towns? What's happening now, and do you think that it will be a lasting change?
We're seeing two big trends in travel. The first trend in travel is what I would call essentially travel redistribution. It used to be that hundreds of millions of people would go to just a few big cities. In the United States, those would be New York City, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Miami, Chicago, and they would go to the tourist districts and they'd visit really popular landmarks. What you end up having is something that was labeled over tourism. A lot of people concentrating in a very small area. Because people aren't flying, they don't want to be in crowds and lines, mostly for health reasons, they're dispersing. The travel is being redistributed to small communities, but they're not going to any one community. And so what's happening is they're being much more spread out. And so now 60% of our business on Airbnb, a business that used to be mostly urban, it used to be 80% urban many years ago, is now 60% non-urban. So even most of Airbnb is non-urban because people are living in less defined areas. The other trend we're seeing is traveling and living starting to blur together. It used to be for many people, they live one place and they travel a couple nights here and there for business if they were so fortunate. And if they were fortunate and privileged enough to be able to take a vacation, they take 1 or 2 weeks vacation. What we're starting to see are millions of people for whom traveling and living is blurring. They are leaving their area and they want to get a house somewhere else. Maybe they're in a city and they want to get out in the country. Maybe they're a bunch of college kids, their college isn't back on campus and they don't want to live home with mom and dad, so they're getting an Airbnb with a bunch of friends in some other city. Maybe they want to be closer to their family, but they don't want to actually live with their family, so they're getting a home nearby. So there's all these use cases where traveling and living are blurring and the length of stay is increasing to a week, a month, or even a couple months at a time. That's a whole new use case that really didn't exist in a really, really big way before the pandemic like it does today.
Of course, none of us can tell which things are phenomena and which are long-term trends, but what is Airbnb's business bet about what the new normal is going to be like a couple of years from now, whether these trends will continue?
It's a great question, and nobody knows, so you're asking me to try to predict the future, and that's always a slightly precarious proposition. But let me tell you what I think is what seems to might play out. Clearly, the world we're living in today is not the rest of history. That's clear. But we also know that the world's never going back to the way it was. I know travel is never going back to the way it was in January. Change goes forward. Change does not go backward. But just because the world and travel is never going back to the way it was in January doesn't mean the travel industry is doomed or people participating in it are doomed. I think what's going to happen is the genie's out of the bottle a little bit on small communities, small destinations, on people visiting national parks. There's 400 national parks, and the average American is a tank away from a national park and has never visited one. So there's a whole new part of the world I think people are discovering. The rural America, small town America, national parks. And it's not like people didn't know these places exist. They just didn't really travel there. In fact, there's often not hotels in these areas. But I think there's going to be a little bit of a democratization of travel. And people will go back to cities. They will go back to tourist districts. It's just that when they go back, it's going to be more of a concentrated balance. They're not going to just go back to urban areas. They're not going to just go back to resorts. And I think that's ultimately probably for the best of almost all communities.
Here's a final quick question. Airbnb has been frequently in the news about the possibility of an IPO. It was going to happen this year. It was going to happen not this year. It was going to happen before or after the election. How should we think? What should we watch for in the news?
Well, we filed our S-1 registration statement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. That puts me in a quiet period, which means I can't say very much about it. But what I can say is what I've said previously, which is we were planning to go public before the pandemic. Then suddenly, obviously, COVID-19 hit. We put the S-1 on the shelf. But recently, we dusted off. We filed it. And when the market's ready for Airbnb to be public, we'll be ready.
Great. Well, Brian Chesky, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much.